Thanks for all those kind words. I think I was invited to talk because I'm one of the few faculty members around here old enough to remember all of this.
Is this one yours?
Yeah, the ERC. This one, yeah. And let's get the slideshow. Perfect. I can just hit page up and page down. There's way too much to talk about in a half an hour, so I'm going to speak really quickly. And there's no way to discuss asbestos-related research at Mount Sinai without talking about Dr. Irving Selikoff. And I'm just going to give you a quick review of Dr. Selikoff's history of coming to Mount Sinai and some of the work that he's done. First of all, he came to Mount Sinai and he established the first occupational and environmental health unit in any academic center in the United States in 1960. He had already been examining workers who were asbestos insulators, asbestos products manufacturing workers at the Manville plant in New Jersey, at his chest clinic in Paterson, New Jersey, and he saw this pattern of people coming in with X-ray changes that he learned fairly quickly were asbestos related, and he saw cases of mesothelioma. Which was quite striking because the disease was not well recognized at the time. And at the time that he set up this chest clinic in Paterson, New Jersey, he had already been one of the 4 physicians who developed isoniazid as a treatment for tuberculosis when he was working at the Seaview Hospital in Staten Island. So he already had a distinguished research and clinical research career before he set up this chest clinic in Paterson and began looking at asbestos-related disease. He had been doing that clinical work in the 1950s, and that's really what brought him to Mount Sinai in 1960. With the cooperation of the Asbestos Workers Union and with the cooperation of people who had worked in an asbestos products manufacturing facility in Paterson, New Jersey, the UNARCO plant, he did clinical and mortality studies of these workers and identified early on in the early 1960s the diseases that were associated with asbestos exposure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And there have been updates on those cohorts since the early and mid-1960s. He wrote a landmark paper with Dr. Kyler Hammond, who was head of research for the American Cancer Society, on asbestos-related neoplasia or cancer, and that was a landmark. It's considered a landmark paper in JAMA, which really distinguishes it for its contribution. And he and Dr. Hammond wrote another seminal paper on the relationship between cigarette smoking and asbestos exposure, looking at the insulator population in particular, and identified the clear evidence of synergy, not just additive effects, but synergistic effects. And to date, we still have very few studies of combinations of exposure and the outcomes as a consequence, whether they're simply additive or whether they're multiplicative, as synergy would suggest. We, here at Sinai, identified the household contact disease for the first time in 1976 by looking at the wives and children of asbestos insulators, and then later on the asbestos products manufacturing workers from the UNARCO, to find evidence of clinical disease among them. But Dr. Henry Anderson, who was on our faculty at the time, identified not only that there was scarring lung disease, but that people were dying at excess rates of lung cancer and mesothelioma as well. The big study that Dr. Selikoff reported was the mortality study of some 17,800 insulators who were registered into a prospective cohort mortality study, and it was first reported on in 1976, but the real more extensive report came out in 1979, and much of what we know about what diseases are associated with asbestos exposure came from that study, because up till that point there had never been such a large study of cohort mortality in any occupational group. And we're still using a lot of the information and the updated information that came from that study to understand what asbestos can do to people. Dr. Selikoff and the team here, and he built a very large and expert team, looked at asbestos exposure and its consequences in a number of other populations, and the focus was always on what Dr. Selikoff and others felt was most important from a public health point of view. And that included such things as the number of people involved in the exposure setting. And when he looked at shipyard workers in the late 1970s, it was because there had been over 400 million people exposed in the lead up to the Second World War and during the Second World War who were exposed in shipyards, in shipbuilding, and ship repair. So this clearly was a large public health problem. Much of the disease that we saw earlier in the 20th century resulted from all that shipyard exposure, and that was the reason for its focus. He also looked at asbestos-related disease in merchant marine seamen and published on that in 1990. Sheet metal workers, again, looking at large populations with significant exposure to see what the disease consequences were. There are several key precepts that those of us who came to Mount Sinai and were around Dr. Selikoff came to understand were his primary motivating factors and approach to doing work. One was you've got to prevent exposures if you're going to prevent disease. That went across the board. That was certainly true in the case of asbestos-related disease, and much of his public health effort was directed towards trying to reduce exposure in the workplace and outside the workplace. He didn't diminish the importance of early detection. He didn't diminish the importance of trying to find ways to intervene for those people who had already been exposed. We're talking about millions of people in the United States alive today who have been exposed, who are often waiting for bad news from their annual exam if they get them, that lo and behold this year they have evidence of cancer. And the interest in intervening after exposure, finding ways to identify disease early, finding ways to, with chemopreventive agents, to try to reverse some of those changes that are going on after asbestos exposure has occurred, was something that he was clearly interested in, but from a public health perspective, stopping exposure, reducing exposure was the key issue. Now, he had a real philosophical point that I'm sure many of you have heard from others as well as from him, and that is that it's really important to do good science and it's really important to have good information and data, but if you just hold it up, look at it, and admire it, it doesn't do much in the world. And his precept was you've got to use good science to change the world, to change the exposure conditions, to change the risk of disease, that science is not enough. You've got to be somehow active in society to make things change. And he came under sharp criticism from some of his scientific colleagues, from the asbestos manufacturing companies, from some other quarters, for his willingness to go to the press, to go to politicians, to try to create a coalition and an understanding of the need for change, that it wasn't enough to publish in journals, that you had to find ways to get this information out into the world because it meant life and death difference for people who were going to be exposed and who were at risk for disease. And he meant by that that researchers have to act politically. You know, he was, in fact, criticized sharply for that. It never deterred him. You know, for a while when he was running around the world, sounding the alarm about asbestos exposure, what the serious public health consequences were going to be, he was followed by people hired by the asbestos companies to every meeting where they took his picture and tried to get into the press to essentially undermine his message. There was a time when the asbestos companies came to Mount Sinai to the Board of Trustees and said, can't you shut this man up? Right? He's causing so much difficulty. He's an economic disaster for us. Fortunately, the Board of Trustees didn't step in to try to do anything. I can't imagine what would have come from that confrontation, but it was clear that Dr. Selikoff was very intent on changing things in the world. And as part of that, he saw the necessity of collaborating with unions. He was a supporter of workers' organizations, both because he saw them as ways to better the conditions in the workplace and for the lives of working people in general, but in a very particular way, because if you want to do cohort mortality studies, if you want to do clinical epidemiological work, you've got to work with the organizations that can bring people in. Right? It's not that he never would work with employers. That's not the case. I sat in many meetings where he attempted, and sometimes successfully, to get employers to essentially cooperate and collaborate in clinical and epidemiological research. But overwhelmingly, his approach was to go to the unions. And the successful work that he did with the insulators and with other populations, the sheet metal workers, and we can name a bunch of them, really came because he collaborated with unions, saw their importance, and saw their value in trying to do the kind of research that's important in occupational medicine. I'll just sort of close about Dr. Selikoff with this one quote that's attributed to him. I don't know if it's originally his quote, but the statistics are human beings with the tears wiped away. This was, as one got to know him better, one saw aspects of Selikoff that went beyond the purely scientific and even the good clinician and the good a politically active person. He was a person with a genuine heart. And, as he came close to his death in 1993, I learned that there were patients that he had begun seeing in the 1950s and 60s in Patterson that he continued to see, who would never get an operation, never go on a medicine without talking to Dr. Solokoff first. He had enormous compassion, and I heard him give 3 speeches where he said that compassion is a biological trait in the human species, that this is something that we are hardwired for. It's brought out clearly in episodes of disaster, but it's in most of us, probably with a bell-shaped distribution. But it guides us and influences the way we look at exposures for working people and the general public, because the whole issue is to reduce disease and misery. And I think that really was the guiding thing that drove him to not just be a scientist, but to try to really change things for people. Now, he developed the Environmental Sciences Laboratory, which focused on shape policy and regulation, and really basic scientific understanding of some of the most important exposures that are encountered in our society. Certainly asbestos. You're going to hear some about lead. Vinyl chloride, when that was a big issue in the synthesis of polyvinyl chloride, which is such a prevalent plastic material. We did some of the early studies, Dr. Suzuki and Dr. Lillis, who are part of our staff, methyl mercury, PCBs, the organochlorine species. I could go on. If you look at all the publications that came out of Mount Sinai from 79 to the current time, the range of exposures, the range of research is really quite staggering. Let's talk about some of the particular research, and I'm mentioning brake repair first. And what are we talking about with brake repair? We're talking about this. I don't know how well this shows, but here's a brake repair mechanic. He's got an air hose, and he's blowing out the area of the brake housing with this air hose. He's not wearing any respiratory protection, and I think that this is working. You can see all this dust here. Right? And at the time the reason why I'm putting this up first is because when I came to Mount Sinai in 79 as a resident, within 3 days they whisked us off by bus, as I recall, someplace in northern Westchester to look at a bunch of brake manufacturing workers that he had organized with the UAW. Because the issue at the time is that does brake dust pose a human health risk? Because chrysotile asbestos, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, was the type of material used in brake manufacturing, and obviously that's what's in that dust, and there was debate and controversy of whether chrysotile was a significant health hazard and could cause some of the worst of the diseases like mesothelioma. And one of the points of this study was to look at the question of whether interstitial fibrosis, asbestosis, and pleural scarring, the kinds of things we see on an X-ray after asbestos exposure, were detectable in this population, and lo and behold, it was. Now, the reason why I think this is of interest is we're back in the battle over brake repair again. Right? It was just a couple of years ago when the release of an updated advisory from OSHA was held up, because the industry forces said there's no basis to put out such an advisory. The health consequences of brake repair are too minimal to consider, so you don't have to do it. And there was a big political fight, and it did just come out within the last year, right? But only after a huge battle, and the battle was centered over the question of whether chrysotile can cause the kind of harm that other forms of asbestos can. It's certainly a hot issue when it comes to medical legal cases for those people who have worked in brake repair, brake manufacture, develop a mesothelioma, cancer of the lining of the lung. Those cases are vigorously fought by industry, case by case, and the whole epidemiology and toxicology of chrysotile asbestos gets introduced. Now, there's some excellent work that's been done compiling all the research on brake repair and chrysotile to try to fight this, because we're talking about thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who are involved in such activities every year, and the question is what risk they really face. So this is a problem that was addressed in 79 when I first got here, and it's still with us today as a policy and practical question. Now, one of the major things that occurred here at Mount Sinai was the work done on asbestos in place. And Dr. Solokoff, I don't know if he coined this or whether he adopted it, but talked about 3 ways of asbestos exposure. The first being mining and processing of asbestos materials, much of which goes on in Canada, not so much in the United States, and other places around the world are still mining and processing asbestos, putting it into insulation materials and other materials, and that's the first wave of exposure, essentially the production end. And then there are all those people in the second wave who used the stuff, who applied it to boilers, to pipes, to fireproofing spray-ons, the host of ways that asbestos, thousands and thousands of applications that asbestos has been used in, right? And that was the second wave of exposure, considerable heavy exposures. But we've gone pretty far beyond that since the late 1970s, because while there never has been a ban of asbestos in the United States, and I don't know how many people in this room are aware that asbestos has not been banned, there are many people working in the trades where asbestos exposure has occurred who believe that there was a ban in the 1970s. There was an attempt, but it was defeated by industry forces. In any event, there's asbestos all over the place in millions of buildings throughout all of North America, throughout the world, really. And those people who have to do renovation work, who do repair work, who do maintenance work, and certainly at the time of building demolition, there is opportunity for exposure. The industry forces said, leave it alone. Don't touch it. After all, those secretaries don't show much in the way of disease who work in such buildings. The students don't show much disease. The teachers don't show much. That was never the issue. The issue of the people is for people who disturb these materials in place, and that's the mechanics, the boiler operators, all those people who in the course of their daily work have to come into contact with this material and disturb it, aren't just simply residing in or working in buildings in passive state, but in fact are actively disturbing. So there ensued a series of clinical epidemiological studies of various populations looking at the issue of how much disease, what risks come from the disturbance of all these asbestos-containing materials in place in buildings all over the place. And we saw industrial electricians, steam fitters, utility workers. You can look at the list yourself, right? And in each of these populations, we saw a high prevalence of asbestos-related scarring on X-ray. Some of these populations have been followed with mortality studies, and lo and behold, we see excesses of lung cancer and mesothelioma in them. So this was an attempt to make clear that there is a serious public health risk that is caused by the presence of asbestos in buildings and factories and refineries and ships. I was going to show you some pictures. Let me show you some pictures. Here's asbestos that's fallen onto a drop ceiling in a building. And those people who have to go above that drop ceiling to run wiring, to do repair work, when they lift that panel off, everyone's showered with debris. They've done good simulation studies and found very high concentrations in the breathing zone of people who actually run telephone cables across such areas of contamination. So it's clearly a serious problem here. This is the World Trade Center where they sprayed this material on as fireproofing. You can see that sheet metal worker and that industrial electrician who worked on that junction box and that duct, after the spray had occurred, had plenty of exposure. I can guarantee you no one warned them and no one said wear a respirator. That's why when we looked at sheet metal workers and looked at industrial electricians clinically, we see high rates of asbestos-related disease on their x-rays. Here's asbestos-containing material that's fallen off of pipes, right? All these materials deteriorate over time. They delaminate, they fall to the floor, they're tracked throughout a building, and if it's not removed, before such disturbance and deterioration occurs, there's plenty of opportunity for exposure, especially to the maintenance personnel. Here's a ship, right? That's a boiler of a ship, right? There isn't an inch of that boiler that isn't insulated with asbestos, because the efficiency of energy transfer depends on that in a ship, right? And those people involved in ship repair, ship breakdown, which is not something that goes on in this country so much. Now it's going on more in developing countries, where, workers are asked to do this kind of work, told to do this kind of work without any respiratory protection, horrible exposures. And you can see why, because there's so much asbestos that ships have within them because of heat transfer issues, that these things are essentially floating boilers that are heavily insulated with lots of risk to the people who do that work. Now, another really important issue that came along back in the early 80s was whether chrysotile asbestos, the two basic types of asbestos. One is chrysotile, which is called serpentine, has certain characteristics, and then a whole class of asbestos forms called amphiboles. No one argues about whether the amphiboles can cause the full range of asbestos malignancies and scarring lung disease, but there are big fights about chrysotile. And the fight centered not so much on the lung cancer risk and scarring, although the asbestos manufacturers like to say it's not so bad for that either, but the real issue is whether it causes mesothelioma at all, or whether it causes mesothelioma with less potency than the amphiboles. And the chrysotile defense hit the fan. I forget when that article in Science was published, in the early 1980s, where some researchers said essentially the chrysotile is the safe form of asbestos. I was driving across the George Washington Bridge to work, and a researcher by the name of Guy from Yale was on the radio saying, "Oh, we have a safe form of asbestos." And he used that actual language, safe form of asbestos. And I nearly drove off the road. I was so shocked by the language, that someone would put that view out with the potential public health consequences, of following that notion, that I was truly horrified and thought we're going to be dealing with a storm of controversy now because 95% of all of the asbestos that comes into the country, and I'll show you a picture of what it looks like, serpentine. It's a wavy fiber. Each one of these fibers can be teased out into finer fibrils and gets separated in the lung tissue, by the way, so the exposures can be very extensive, even with what appears to be not so great an exposure when you count these fibers. So the issue was, okay, how much harm can come from exposure to this chrysotile material? Most of it came from Canada. 95% of what we use in the country it was chrysotile. And again, the dispute is over mesothelioma. Now, we at Sinai had an opportunity to look at that question because it turns out that the insulators, these asbestos workers that put all this material on, had the experience of using only chrysotile for quite a long time. And then there was a period when amosite, an amphibole, was introduced into the sort of the stream of insulation products, and then less amphibole after that. So you had a period where you had much more amphibole, and presumably, given the latency period of mesothelioma, over the course of the next 20, 30, 40 years, you should have seen a blip in mesothelioma occurrence if that amphibole, that amosite that was introduced, had a different health consequence from what chrysotile has. We never saw the blip. The rate of mesothelioma remained very high. We're talking about people dying at a rate of 15% of mesothelioma among these insulators, compared to something in the ballpark of 3 per million per year in the United States. We're talking about background rates that are very low, but in this population, 15% of the population dies of mesothelioma. And much of it, the great majority of what they were exposed to, was chrysotile asbestos. Now, the other thing that was done here at Mount Sinai that's a very important area of research was that of Dr. Suzuki. Suzuki was an environmental pathologist who worked with Dr. Selikoff. I think he was here a decade before I came in 1979, and a remarkable, remarkable researcher with such tremendous integrity and technical skill. And he looked at the lung tissue of people who had developed mesothelioma, and he was expert in determining fiber burden, how much asbestos fiber and of what type is present in tissue. And he developed the techniques that are still in use today by the best of the electron microscopists who count these kinds of things. And what he found when he looked at the tissue of patients who had developed mesothelioma is short chrysotile fiber right under the pleura, not amphiboles, but short chrysotile fiber. Now, you can say that the presence of that material is irrelevant to the fact that mesothelioma is developed. But I can tell you that most people who look at that kind of physical evidence will say if the stuff is there, it's proximate to the area where the tumor arises, it's at least reasonable to think that this may have played a causal role, or at least some contributory role. You don't see amphiboles out there, so if they're acting, they have to be acting at a distance, right? So that research that Dr. Suzuki did on human beings was then repeated in baboon studies. He had inhalation studies going, and lo and behold, the baboons developed mesothelioma. And what do you see in the periphery of the lung near the pleura? Short chrysotile. This work has been confirmed by others, right? It's never been argued away by those forces who like to say that chrysotile is a safe material and won't cause mesothelioma. And they don't know what to do with these, data that Suzuki has developed that are so persuasive. Another really important issue, and it remains an important issue, that the Sinai group focused on and did effective research on, was cancer in non-pulmonary sites. The studies of the asbestos workers and the Unarco plant workers who made those asbestos products quite clearly showed not just cancer of the lung, not just deaths from the scarring lung disease asbestosis, not just mesothelioma, but elevated rates of GI tract cancer from the mouth and throat all the way to the rectum and anus. The updated study of the insulators that was published in 1991, which carried the mortality update through 1986, now showed pancreatic cancer in excess as well as kidney cancer. And the issue of whether asbestos exposure can give rise to GI tract cancers and cancers of the larynx and some of these other non-pulmonary sites remains a big fight today. IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is sort of a pretty authoritative body that's international that looks at the data, either supporting or failing to support relationships between exposures and cancer, just recently came out with a pronouncement saying that, okay, they'll buy a laryngeal cancer on the basis of the epidemiological data. They're saying that there is supportive information for GI tract cancer, but not conclusive enough to say that this is a defined relationship. Well, this is an important issue because when you're talking about colon cancer, which is the second most common cause of death in men, you're talking about an excess of over 60% that was reported by Dr. Selkoff. So you're talking about a lot of deaths as a consequence, if in fact this relationship is real. Others outside of Mount Sinai have looked at this relationship. There's uneven results from a number of epidemiological studies, but the great majority of the studies, that are done well, do show such a relationship, and it will not shock me if an updating of the mortality of these insulators, which we're about to engage in, doesn't continue to bear out this relationship that GI tract cancers are related to asbestos exposure. Another big important issue, pleural scarring. Asbestos in the chest cavity attacks two places. One, it attacks the lung tissue itself, and that's defined as asbestosis, where the parenchyma of the lung is affected. But the lung is lined with a saran wrap kind of covering called the pleura, and the inside of the chest wall is wrapped with the same kind of plastic wrap stuff. The abdominal organs are also lined with this kind of thin membrane, and it's a target for asbestos, quite clearly, and that's called pleural thickening, pleural scarring in the chest. Now, it used to be thought that this phenomenon of pleural scarring was the German word for it on X-ray is beauty mark. Kind of cynical, but that was in fact the thinking, rather than that it had an effect on pulmonary function, exercise tolerance, and that sort of thing. And it's big implications, both for clinical care. If you have a patient come into you whose X-ray only shows pleural scarring, but there's clearly loss of lung function, there's clearly loss of exercise tolerance. If you believe that it's just a beauty mark, you can start looking for other causes, and believe that the pleural scarring doesn't play a role in this. If you're persuaded that pleural scarring can have an effect on lung function and exercise tolerance, then you're going to think differently about that patient. And for sure, when it comes to policies regarding compensation, all these bankruptcies that these companies have gone through, who want to give people a card, because they only have pleural scarring, come back later, kid, when you have something real, is very damaging. If in fact pleural scarring is associated with real physiological consequence. It's important to understand that. And some of the finest studies, not the first studies, but some of the best studies looking at the relationship between pleural disease only, in the absence of scarring of the lung tissue itself, only that scarring of the lining of the lung, were done here at Mount Sinai by the remarkable Dr. Ruth Lillis, who passed away just several years ago, an incredibly skilled and careful researcher. They developed an index, a quantitative index of pleural scarring, and then looked at the relationship between that index and how pulmonary function was doing. It showed a clear statistical relationship. The more scarring you had, the more calcification in the scar. I was going to show you some pictures. The lower your lung function was on group. That's not true of every individual, but lo and behold, it was true in the population, and you could show it quite clearly and significantly. And that's big relevance for the Libby, Montana thing, which I'll talk about in just a second. Here's what we're talking about with pleural scarring. This is a regular chest X-ray, and it's this white area here that doesn't belong there, and this calcified area that you're looking right through an area of scarring, and I'll show you what it looks like on a CT scan. All this white material here doesn't belong there. Right, that's calcified pleural scarring that's seen on a CT scan. This is what it looks like at surgery. This person being operated on for lung cancer, and there's this big plaque big band of fibrous tissue right on the surface of the lung. The most normal pleura looks like that. You can see right through it to the underlying lung tissue. That band of fibrous scars, what we're seeing on X-ray in the other pictures. And this is what it looks like. I'm sorry to do this to you right before your coffee break. But this is the inside of the chest wall, which is lined by this thin membrane, and you can't even see anything there. You can look right through to the ribs, et cetera. But all this white, milky stuff is calcified pleural scarring, that is the hallmark of asbestos-related exposure on an X-ray or on pathology. And any pathologist or radiologist who sees those films or sees this picture will know that asbestos exposure has occurred because nothing produces this picture. Let's see. Did I cover all that? Yeah, okay. So, now I want to talk about something that kind of anticipates what David Zhang is going to talk about, and that's biomarkers. How am I doing in time? I've got a couple more minutes. Dr. Selikoff, in his prescience, back in 1982-83, conducted a study of nearly 3,000 asbestos insulators from 17 cities across North America, because we did go into Canada as well. There are a couple locals that we went to examine these long-term pipe coverers, insulators, who had worked with asbestos extensively in clouds of dust for years and years. And in order to get into the study, you had to have about 25 years since you began your exposure. And these were essentially full-time workers all during that time. They had enormous exposures. Right? And so we clinically characterized them. We examined them from head to toe, took lots of exposure information, lots of clinical symptom information, took X-rays, blood tests, pulmonary function tests. But the real clever thing that Selikoff did, and I'm reminding you, this is 1982-83, before the new genomics and proteomics were available. You could see just the beginnings kind of coming over the horizon because new techniques in gene analysis were just being developed. And he said, let's get a serum specimen or two from every one of these people and store them away in a freezer, because even though we don't know what to do with them now, another decade we're going to know what to do with them. And that was a remarkable thing to do. I don't know how many people were doing such things at the time, but we really stored these things. And I'll just tell you a quick anecdote. These were stored in freezers, and we moved several times, in the course of the years from 1983 up until the more recent times. And following these freezers with the specimens was a real adventure. And Laura Linker over there was the key person to really figure out what happened to our specimens. Because it became important, because we began a collaboration with Dr. Harvey Pass, a mesothelioma surgeon and oncological researcher, cancer researcher at NYU, who's developed biomarkers. Helped develop one called mesothelin, another one called osteopontin, which are predictive of future development within several years of mesothelioma, and pretty robust predictors. And so what we were able to do with Dr. Pass, because we had these serum specimens, we followed what all these 3,000 people, about 1,200 of them had died by 1994. We followed what they died from. We got death certificates. And in the beginning of this study, when we had resources enough to do it, we would get the pathology materials and the X-rays and the clinical records to do what was called best evidence assessment of what the real diagnosis was, because there was underdiagnosis of mesothelioma. Too many times it was called lung cancer, et cetera. So we looked at actual materials, clinical materials, to come up with a diagnosis and used death certificates at the same time, because that's the conventional way to look at mortality. And lo and behold, we saw very high rates of lung cancer, very high rates of mesothelioma, deaths from asbestosis. Not a great surprise. But what was really important was now you knew who died of mesothelioma. You could go back to their serum specimens and see, okay, we know when this person died of mesothelioma. It's usually within a year of the time of diagnosis, unfortunately. So we had a pretty clear idea of when the diagnosis was made, and you could go back then and look at the serum specimen and say, was it elevated? And how high was it elevated? And one of the questions, if you're developing biomarkers, is how high does the level have to get before you say, okay, this is truly predictive? How much does scarring itself produce an elevation of these markers? Right? And then there's the horrible question of having an elevated marker in a patient, not being able to see anything on it in the imaging studies like a CAT scan and a PET scan, and figuring out, well, what am I going to do now besides put this individual on an antidepressant? Because he now knows, and they're he now knows that he's at great risk for mesothelioma, and we can't find it. Well, we're developing a protocol to do aggressive but not horribly invasive searching for evidence of a mesothelioma when the marker is up. And that's kind of the next stage in doing early detection work with these high-risk populations. There are other markers that are currently under evaluation that may be really good predictors that mesothelioma is going to occur. We don't have such good markers in lung cancer unless David Zhang is going to tell us something new. Now, and I'll finish with this Libby, Montana thing, and I'll speak quickly. Libby, Montana is it's a small town up in the northwest corner of Montana. It's a town of about 10,000 people, entirely dusted by the effluents from a mine, a vermiculite mine, that was operated by W.R. Grace since the 1960s, and they bought the mine knowing that it was laced. The material, vermiculite, is not mined for its asbestos content. It's an intense contaminant. It's up to 20% contaminated with tremolite and other asbestos-formed minerals. It is the place in the United States where you have the highest death rates from asbestosis in the country. It's the highest priority Superfund site, and it is really the only Superfund site in the United States where you can say these deaths occurred as a consequence of these exposures. In all of the Superfund sites, there's real reason to believe that people are at risk and deaths have occurred. But when you've got excess mesotheliomas and a high rate of lung cancer in this population, there's no question about what's going on. So you had this company essentially spewing this material out into the town and into the woodlands. And right now there's a criminal trial going on against the W.R. Grace executives who ran this plant for violation of the Clean Air Act since 1999. Not because they gave the tailings from this mine to the schools to build the running track. Not because they gave it to the town to build the bedding for the playgrounds in town, knowing that it contained asbestos. Not because they killed well over 600 people, in a town of 10,000, right? But because they violated the Clean Air Act. W.R. Grace knows how to operate legally and politically, and knew how to contain this indictment. And while some people may in fact go to jail or be punished in some fashion, the real crimes that were committed look more like manslaughter to me. And I've been out there many times and seen the disease. Unlike, and I'm going to talk about this in just one second, unlike what I see among my population of asbestos workers and many construction workers who have asbestos-related disease, and we follow thousands of them here at Mount Sinai. In Libby, Montana, the people are walking around with oxygen concentrators, because the disease is so severe. They die from asbestosis frequently, right? Unlike the working populations we take care of. There's something different about the character of the disease there. And the EPA is now faced with a question, having fined W.R. Grace for $250 million to clean up the town. How clean do you have to make it before people, can feel safe? And what's the special consequence of exposure to children whose lungs are in development up until the time they're teenagers? And is there something that goes on that's different when asbestos exposure occurs during childhood? These are all questions that the EPA has to face, and they wanted at first to look at the question of animal models. Well, how much disease comes from how much exposure in animals? The community was enraged. We have all this information and all these data on what happens to human beings in this town, and you want to talk to us about mice and rats? Let's figure out what happened to real people and try and reconstruct exposures so that we can get a sense of, okay, how clean does this have to be made before we have to worry about our kids raking, up in the yard or playing ball in the ball field, which is right next to the processing plant. This is the mine that was a few miles out of town, and all that white stuff coming out is not smoke. It's asbestos-containing vermiculite dust, right? And everything, the wood cutters, the loggers in this area have asbestos-related disease because there's so much material embedded in the bark and on the pine needles that their work entails enough exposure that they develop disease. Here's what's contaminating the vermiculite. The vermiculite in and of itself is a relatively harmless material. It's flat, it's plate-like, right? It's good insulating material when you pop it. They put it in ovens and they pop it. It becomes like styrofoam beads. But it's laced with all these forms of asbestiform minerals. Not all of them have been classified as asbestos. There's wincherite and richterite, which looks like asbestos, acts like asbestos, does the same thing to animals, and it looks like to people, as asbestos. But W.R. Grace says that wasn't regulated, so we don't have to worry about that, even though we knew that the workers were getting disease because we did the x-rays back in the 60s and never told the workers that their x-rays showed anything. So they knew that the stuff could cause disease, whatever you name the stuff. This is vermiculite attic insulation, which is in millions of homes in North America. And this is less than 1% asbestos, by the way. There's recently an attempt to get a ban on asbestos, but to exempt things that are less than 1% in content. This is less than 1% in content, and you disturb it, and you get levels within seconds that are higher than the OSHA standard. And nothing binds this asbestos. in this material. And so simple disturbance, causes an increase in levels that are, very potentially dangerous. And here's the kids, right? These are mine tailings given by the mine, by W.R. Grace to the town, deposited here and there, right? Free crushed rock, right? If you analyze this stuff, at least 10% asbestos, right? And the kids are playing on this. This is current. This isn't, historic. There's enough information in the community now to be worried about this, but we still see evidence of exposure still going on. Very distinctive features of disease. It's a pleural attacker. The level of pleural disease is different from anything that I've ever seen on x-rays, on CT scans, and very rapid progression. Every one of us here at Mount Sinai who takes care of all the construction workers we see for asbestos-related disease has pretty much the same experience. This is a slow, insidious disease. If it progresses over 10, 15, 20 years. You don't see sudden, rapid change in people except in the most rare of instances. Out there in Libby, many, many patients with only environmental exposure, never worked in the mine, never worked in the processing plant, develop very rapid change in the pleural compartment of their scarring, sometimes in the parenchymal, the lung tissue compartment as well. And it's so dramatic that we're publishing a paper that shows this very clearly. Within 3 years, marked change from a very thin rind of scarring to extensive thickened scar. The other thing that's found out there is that even with minimal pleural thickening, you get big loss of lung function. We don't understand why that's so. The real suspicion is that it's just not a mechanical restriction on lung function, but there's fibrosis in the tissue right under that pleural thickening that's not easy to image on CT scan, that's probably there, and you need histopathological studies, and we're going to probably be doing that on biopsy and autopsy specimens as we go forward in Libby. But there's something distinctive there because you see so much loss of lung function in people who don't look like they have so much scarring. The other thing is you have an asthma-like picture. We don't see asthma in our construction workers who have asbestos-related disease, and none of them. They have the same prevalence of asthma as anybody else, in our society. But we don't. In Libby, Montana, high proportions of people have reversible airway disease, and that's not the target of asbestos conventionally. So we're seeing something there that really is distinctive, and we also see autoimmune effects there. And it's not the first time this has been addressed. In other populations, autoimmune effects have been found. Solikoff did a study of that with others back in the 1970s, and other institutions have published on this. But out there, 2 good studies were done. One looking at autoimmune antibodies of the anti-DNA type, and also rheumatoid arthritis prevalence, confirmed on, with physician diagnosis. So you have high rates of rheumatoid arthritis, above background rates, and you have these autoimmune antibody elevations, and both of those things were published in the last few years, and what we want to do is confirm that, lo and behold, the asbestos types out there and the exposures are giving rise to this because it's important. And we have just submitted a proposal to the ATSDR to study asbestos-related disease in Libby. What happens when you're exposed only as kids and left after high school and never came back to Libby because there was no jobs there, right? And what happens to people clinically? We're going to bring some of those people back for examination. What happens to your autoimmune function? And we're going to look also at the issue of rapid radiographic progression on CT of these changes. And with that, I'm going to shut up. I came close to my time, I think. Thanks very much.